Hi students, this is Ms. Wildy. This will be our video lecture over Chapter 8, Political Geography. As always, keep your study guide out or a piece of paper to jot down some questions you want to ask in class, things you would like me to reiterate better than what I can do in about 20 or 30 minutes of this. We're going to start off by thinking about what political means. Political usually is associated with governments or the way that countries or states are organized. And so, of course, our key question to start out with is, how is space politically organized? We're gonna start off with a field note, which was about Ghana and the first president after independence. And the real emphasis of the field note is really the quote on the statue, which is, "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude and tranquility." And so, maybe the main point or discussion that we can just have about this is whether it really is worth even corrupt governments and having issues and even danger, but having independence and having the right to make those decisions ourselves, rather than being at the beck and call of another country that controls us, even if it's somewhat peaceful. So sort of looking at that is a main focus of our chapter, and how different states organize themselves, how they work with other states, how they deal with different groups that may have different opinions. All of those kind of things have to do with this chapter. And of course, this also, I like to bring up the fact that it goes along with our Berlin Conference project, trying to look at those superimposed boundaries that the European countries put on Africa in 1884, and how the effects of that have still been around. So in terms of fundamental information for this chapter, it's really vocab driven. So a state, you should think of a state kind of like a country, in other words. So a country would have population, it would have boundaries or a territory, it would have a government in place, some sort of government in place, and maybe the most important thing is that it has to be recognized by other countries, at least by the majority of other countries. And that is truly what a state is. Territoriality is a little bit more complex of a term, and it's sort of the idea that people want to control an area. Maybe it's through government means, as a dictator, or through a federal system. Maybe it's just having a territory, an area that we can claim ourselves, whether it be our room in our house or whether it be a more complex area, but that need is a part of all humans. Sovereignty also goes along with having a state recognized by other countries. You have the last say or the power or control over that area. And then along those same lines, if you have that power, you should also be able to defend your territory, and that's what territorial integrity is. So keeping track of these terms is a major thing. The modern state idea of what we associate and what a state or a country is today really came about because of Europe, most specifically in the idea of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That this idea of what a state is about and how Europe was organized really came about around this time period. And then those European countries went and colonized other areas. Remember, the idea of mercantilism is you want to have more exports than imports. So to have a territory or have a colony, you can have those people work for you. You can have their resources be a part of your resources. You can export more. You don't have to buy as much, blah, blah, blah. Led to colonialism. And this is why when the European countries went to different places in the world, like the New World, North America, South America, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, they put their ideas of what a state is and how it should work, and in turn how economies should work and how the economic well-being of those countries should work, and that's still in part applicable today. We still use those ideas. Some more vocab just to kind of get through. A nation, maybe this was misunderstood in previous years of schooling, and we always say one nation under God as the United States Pledge of Allegiance, but we're not really a nation, because a nation is one homogenous group of people that share a common past. And I don't know that you can really say America as a whole has that. We have multiple nations, I would argue, but we're not necessarily one nation. Along that same line, a nation state, you're combining that idea of a country with a nation, a group of people. So a nation state would be one country with one group of people. This is very difficult to actually have in the world. It is what most peace treaties in the world trying to produce, because they feel like there'll be less conflict as a result. And again, the ideal nation-state idea came from Europe. That's why there are so many different little tiny countries within Europe, because they're trying to create that nation-state idea. In reality, it's not so much the case, but it is what was attempted. There are nation-states in the world. I think you can always say Japan is for all intents and purposes a nation-state. It is one country with one nation, one group of people with that common culture. A lot of times you can kind of use the same examples that we came up with monolingual states, because they tend to have one culture group that's dominant in one country, so that would be a nation state. Multinational state is what we are. That's what the United States is. It's one country with more than one group of people with a shared history. This is also the former Yugoslavia. Would be a multinational state, an example of that. Most countries of the world are going to be multinational states. A multi-state nation is, of course, going to go from the back end of it. So the nation is a group of people that occupy more than one country. So in the book, they just talk about the people of Transylvania, the Transylvanian Alps specifically, people who live in those mountains. Those cross between Hungary and Romania. So the Transylvanians are the group of people, are the nation, and they are crossing between the state of Romania and the state of Hungary, so that is a multi-state nation. And then lastly, a stateless nation is a group of people that don't have a country. They would like one. So the Kurds, even though we discuss Kurdistan, there is no country of Kurdistan. And also, of course, you could also talk about the Palestinians as being a stateless nation. They would like their own country. They do not have it. The Basque are a stateless nation. So there's several examples of those that we've talked about in not only this chapter, but previous chapters as well. The idea of nation and territory, again, that idea of wanting to have a control over an area, and because of that common history, that's that nation and territory idea. And of course, that is back to what we discussed earlier with colonialism. It's the reason European countries went in search of resources and people to make more money, to be politically strong. So to give a little bit more history on this idea, there are two main waves of colonialism. The first main wave was between 1500 and 1825, and the real two main players in this wave were Spain and Portugal. They were trying to establish that capitalist system of economy. So trying to have, again, the mercantilism, having more exports than imports, profit, making money was really their goal. So they went and found territory that wasn't quote unquote claimed, took it, made it theirs, took the resources, made money from that. Now, unfortunately for Spain and Portugal, they had a major issue with inflation because of the silver, and the value of their silver went down. So they weren't as much involved in the second wave of colonialism. They pretty much had said, spent too much money, didn't have enough money to really seek out more land and claim more. They didn't really get rid of their original colonies, but they didn't seek out more. So the second wave between 1825 and 1975 really was other Western European countries like Britain, France, the Dutch and the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Italy. And again, they wanted economic profit. They wanted to continue that idea of capitalism, but they were also trying to spread Christianity. In turn, both of these waves established that idea of a state system, or how states are organized. And in turn, we still have the remains of those waves. We still have a capitalist system for the world economy. We still have those state procedures that were in place then. Of course, Christianity is still the major religion of the world as a result of this. So a lot of the effects of colonialism still remain today. This is a map that, this map as well as this map are important to kind of compare and contrast. So the first one is dominant colonial influences between 1550 and 1950. You should, notice that Europe is a major player, specifically Great Britain, major player in having colonies. But even beyond that, look at the non-European countries. Japan, Russia, U.S., those also had dominant colonial influence, and especially, even that still remains today. We still have, we may not call them colonies, but we still have territory that we sort of oversee. Then decolonization happened, okay? And so countries that had been colonized gained their independence. The first wave is what the United States was from. So, 1700s, really, you see much more of that. So most of the North and South America gained their independence in the first wave. Second wave is when you have the Africa and Asia independence after World War II, really. So again, the effects, though, of colonialism are still seen, and that's why we still have issues in Africa. We still have this dependency between countries that happened as a result of colonialism, even though decolonization happened. One of the major theories of this chapter that you really need to make sure you understand is Wallerstein's world systems theory. And before we get there, again, the textbook authors really want you to understand what capitalism is about and what the world economy is about. So they bring up this pointillism artwork, which is by Seurat. And the point they try and make is, if you go up close to this painting, you will see dots. That's all you'll see, just colored dots. And when you stand back and see the whole picture, that's when you see the image of people having a lovely afternoon by the park. You have to stand back and look at the economy as a whole, the global economy, to truly understand how it works. You can't just look at one individual country and how their economy works, because it isn't just that one country. They're not self-sufficient. They have to rely on other countries, either to buy their goods or to buy goods from them, or use them for other things. So Wallerstein was a theorist that came up with the world systems theory. He said, we have one global world economy, but that each country is involved in the division of labor. And each country is either going to be basically being exploited or exploiting. And that system has a three-tier structure, which is, let me skip ahead a little bit. The three-tier structure are the core, which are your wealthy countries, much more technology, much more wealth, of course, higher levels of education. They are the dominant players, of course, in the world economy, but they couldn't be where they are without the peripheral and semi-peripheral. The peripheral countries are your lower wealth, lower education, lower salaries. They tend to do more of the resource getting, as well as maybe some of the manufacturing that happens for the core. They rely on the core for that work, and the core rely on them for their work, for their resources. The semi-peripheral are in the middle, so they may have some core process going on. They may have wealthy people in their countries, but they also have the manufacturing too. They also have the poorer ones. And there's sort of a buffer between the core and the peripheral. So again, this is a map of the world, and you should know this map pretty well. You should understand and be able to identify, if I say Saudi Arabia, you should know Saudi Arabia is yellow, which means it's semi-peripheral. If I said Singapore, remember Singapore is right at the tip of Malaysia. It's very hard to see on this map, but you should know that Singapore is a major port city for the region of Southeast Asia. It makes quite a bit of money. It's not quite up there with the United States and Canada or even Australia, but it is the semi-peripheral. It's the yellow. Even though it's surrounded by peripheral countries, it exploits the other countries around it, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, for resources and labor, and it is being exploited because of its port city by other countries like Australia or Western Europe countries or North American countries. So understanding this map pretty well, that's an important thing to remember for the test, for the exam as well. Real quickly to go back to these terms, we kind of talked on most of these, but I want to reiterate a little bit about commodification. So commodification is the idea of buying and selling goods. We mentioned it previously in chapter 4 with culture, where you could have a local culture or even pop culture sort of engaging in commodification, where you buy and sell something that didn't used to be bought and sold. In this case, anything that is bought and sold is a commodity, so it's engaging in commodification. So again, that relates to the idea of capitalism, where you want to make a profit, and in turn, colonialism came about as a result of those ideas, trying to make money, trying to buy and mostly sell, and so those terms and keeping track of those terms is important for this chapter. And lastly, I think the main idea here is when you have more wealth, when you are a core country, you have more influence. You have more political power in the world. That can come back and bite you in the butt, but of course that is you sort of want it and don't want it at the same time. It's sort of a double-edged sword. So you want to have that wealth, you want to have that political power and influence. People respect you, people look to you. You can make better decisions or stronger decisions, but then people rely on you as well, and especially for not only political influence but also economic influence. So that's always sort of a double-edged sword. Okay, this next section is a lot of boundary things as well as types of governments. So the two forms of government we really focus on here are unitary and federal. Unitary is a highly centralized government. Most of all decisions are made by this central government, by this capital city, for example, or this one person, for example. That's a unitary system. The other term is federal. Federal is a government where you have your central power, but you also have regional governments that also have some say in how things are done. They have some decision-making power. Of course, the United States is a federal system because we have our federal government in Washington, D.C. making decisions. We also have state-run governments that make decisions for the state. They can't override any decision by the federal government, but there are certain goals of the state government that are given to them as a way of trying to have them have more say, I guess. In Nigeria, we've talked about Nigeria briefly in the past, but the issue with Nigeria is that it has a Muslim majority in the north and a Christian majority in the south of the country. So again, Sharia laws are up in the north. This is a federal system because the north can make laws related to the Quran, related to their religious belief. The south does not have those. So this is a federal system. If it were a unitary system, whatever the government religion was, if there is one, they would determine whether the laws would be Sharia or not. Again, back to this federal system in the United States, there are certain laws or certain policies in which they are given to the state that not federal government. So we've talked about driving age as being a state law, whereas the federal government doesn't really care about that. In this case, like concealed weapons is a state-run thing. Now you can't violate the Second Amendment right to bear arms. That's a federal law. So that's different. But there are certain things that states are allowed to do to try and give them a little more say-so, I guess. You can't, of course, declare war. You can't have your own currency in a state system. You can't engage in trade with other countries. That's a federal law. But there are certain things that states are given in order to kind of have them feel like they have a little more say, I guess, for their particular group of people. Now, when you move from a central government or giving power from central to more regional governments, this is called devolution. And there are different types of devolution. There's ethnocultural, economic, and spatial. Ethnocultural means you are giving more power or more rights to a certain ethnic group or culture group within your country. So again, when we talk about former Yugoslavia, when that dissolved into different countries, you were giving rights to certain ethnic groups, the Bosnians, the Serbians, the Croatians, blah, blah, blah. That's going to be ethnocultural devolution. Again, this is also related back with Europe, with trying to give nation states or giving countries independence in order to give that nation or that group of people, that culture, group more say so. We discussed Scotland's independence vote that didn't pass, but that is an ethnocultural devolution movement as well. Now Scotland already has devolution in some cases. They're allowed to have their own parliament and make decisions for themselves, but again, they are still part of the United Kingdom. They have not gained independence separately. If they do in the future, that is also devolution. They would have gotten more power and say so completely for themselves as an independent country. Now, economic devolution is where you have an area of a country or a region that has more money. They generate more wealth usually. And so they usually threaten to leave if they're not given more power. So in Spain, Catalonia is a richer portion of Spain, and so it has threatened to leave in the past. And so Spain has given them more power and more say-so, more votes in making decisions because they have that economic power. And then the last type of devolution is spatial devolution, and this is like where you have a distance between that region. So Hawaii is a great example. There's a major ocean that divides Hawaii from the rest of the continental United States. Hawaii has threatened to leave as a result of this. So they are allowed to make certain decisions that other states may not have as a result of trying to keep them intact with the United States. If at some point Hawaii leaves, that is also spatial devolution. But the reason for the move and more power given to them has to do with what type. If it's because of culture, is it because of economy, or is it because of space or distance? Also along the same ideas with ways of forms of government or giving more federal system, you also have ideas of how elections happen or how voting happens. So in federal systems, you tend to have more of these types of governments. Representation, so you may vote for certain regions being represented for voting. Reapportionment is where usually after a census you have to reapportion your districts because there may be certain areas that have influx of population, so they deserve to have more representatives, or you may have a decrease in population, in which case you have less representatives. So usually after a census, there is census, there is a period of reapportionment. Where the districts change up the number of people that are or the districts may change position as well of where they are based on the number of people they can elect. The other issue we have is minority populations getting represented, and that kind of leads us into gerrymandering. It used to be a negative thing. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. You can gerrymander so that a minority group gets representatives. But whatever you're doing, gerrymandering means you're making a new district that is in a bizarre shape in order to give or to benefit one particular political party or ethnic group or minority in some way. And again, majority-minority kind of has to do with this, where districts are drawn so that the majority of the population consists of a minority population for the country or for the region, so that they have a majority and so can get a say-so in the voting. All right, so we're going to continue this with the idea of boundaries and how boundaries are established, the steps in making boundaries, why there are disputes as a result, all those kind of things. This is a lot of memorization or kind of recall, but I think we do need to know this. There are specific questions that have come up on AP exams that relate to these kind of things. And this is sort of also the section where the textbook kind of is not thorough enough. And so I've added some terms that you need to know. I've noticed them on AP exams before, but they haven't been put in our textbook. So I'm going to kind of go through some things that you need to know. Of course, they may be on our test, but you may also see them on the AP exam. So this may be where you have to kind of divert out of the textbook a little bit and kind of add some new terms to your vocabulary. So the first one is in the book, boundary. But the important thing to understand is a boundary between countries is a vertical plane. It's imaginary, of course, but it extends above the land into the airspace above, as well as below the subsoil. Okay, and this is where we can sometimes have some disputes arise because of this imaginary line. But of course, it's not just a fence on the ground. It extends into airspace as well as below the ground. Because it's below the ground, you oftentimes have issues with the resources below ground, like oil, which is usually found underground or underwater. This is called an allocational dispute. We'll talk about these types of disputes in just a little bit. But specifically in the book, they discuss the issue between Iraq and Kuwait because, again, you'll notice this is an oil field that extends between, underneath the border. So if Iraq were drilling oil here, the oil underground from over here in Kuwait might get into Iraq, and that's where there may be a dispute over it. The 4 steps for establishing boundaries are pretty simple. Define, you literally just define the boundary. You can delimit it, that's where you put it on a map. You can demarcate it, that's where you put it on the land, where you actually build a fence or a wall or what have you. And the last part is administrate, and this is where you deal with the cross-border, how am I going to deal with somebody coming from another country into my country and somebody from my country going into that country, vice versa. So because of those steps, we also have disputes. A definitional dispute kind of makes sense with the idea of defining. There's an issue with how we can't agree on how to define it or where it is, just in terms of meeting together and going, we need to make a line between our country. Where are we going to put it? We can't agree on that. That's a definitional dispute. If we've agreed on it, but then we have to make it on a map, and then we can't agree. Or we get to the land and we have to build the wall and we're like, oh wait, I didn't realize it was there. That's a locational dispute. And then we can't agree on it. Operational dispute has to do with the border control or administrating step of the boundaries. And this is where we can't agree on how to deal with somebody that illegally crosses the border, or what paperwork do we look at? Those kind of things are operational disputes. And then allocational has to do with that resource, again, usually underground, where who gets what resource. If it's a river, perhaps, maybe you need water resource. And water for drinking. If you can't agree on where the water from one side is and where the middle of the river is and all those kind of things, and whether I'm pumping water out of your side, blah, 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 that's all allocational disputes. There are 2 types of boundaries, geometric and physical political. Geometric are based on the grid system, so like latitude and longitude lines. And so if you look at a map of the United States and Canada, up until the Great Lakes region, that horizontal line is a latitude line. It is a geometric boundary. Now, if you get into the boundary of the Great Lakes, that's a physical boundary. Also, the Rio Grande River between U.S. and Mexico is a physical boundary. So if it's using a latitude or longitude line, it's usually a very straight line. It has to be a straight line. And you obviously can tell that's a geometric. If it's not, it probably follows a river or a mountain or some other physical feature. That's a physical political boundary. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, these are some terms that we don't have in the textbook. Exclave and enclave. An exclave is a piece of a country that is separate from the other part of the country. So for example, Alaska. Alaska is a part of the United States. It doesn't touch another part of the United States. It touches Canada. But that is an exclave. Kaliningrad, which I believe is what this image is talking about. So Kaliningrad is right here. It's an area of Russia, but it doesn't touch Russia. There's another country in between. That's an exclave. An enclave is where there is sort of a culture group, or an area that is its own like culture group, or its own area within another country. So it's within it. So for example, I think Vatican City is a great example of this. It's a country surrounded by another country. So it is within another country. Now Quebec is its own, it is part of Canada, but it is a separate minority group that has its own province surrounded by the other provinces that are not French speaking. So it is considered an enclave as well. One other term I've seen on the exam that isn't in our textbook is balkanization, and this is somewhat related to the idea of devolution. You're breaking apart or fragmenting a state into smaller regions to try and to keep conflict down. They are often hostile or non-cooperative with each other, so you're trying to give them independence so that they won't fight within the same country. They're given their own country. So that's balkanization. It's related to the idea of where the Balkan Mountains are, and how that area was broken up into different empires or different countries. But we use it now for anywhere in the world where that's happening. Okay, these are the types of, it's called territorial morphology. It's sort of the shapes of states and what they can be. So you can have a compact state. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's usually either round or square. It doesn't have a regularity. It's pretty compact, one shape sort of thing. So Colorado is a good example of this. Poland is relatively round in shape. It doesn't have some things jutting off in different areas. Now, fragmented means it's broken into pieces, like an archipelago. So Japan is a great example of this. The Philippines, anywhere you've got water usually between the different parts of the country, that's a fragmented country. Elongated is stretched out or long. So like Chile is a great example of a country that's elongated, or even Italy. Now, be careful, because you also could have elongated might also be a corrupt or protruded, and that's where you have sort of a peninsula. So again, Italy is going to be sort of corrupt. Florida, Thailand, Mozambique, it's going to be sort of a peninsula, so it's got water on three sides. Now perforated has a hole in the middle. It might be a country in the middle, like for South Africa there is Lesotho that is within the country of it. You also have, it might also be like a lake that may be a hole in the country. Either way, it's perforated in some way. And then landlocked, of course, it has no access to ocean or sea. And those are things like Switzerland or Rwanda are landlocked. So those are different types of terms. They're fairly self-explanatory. So I think if you saw them on the AP exam, you could probably do some sort of process elimination for most of them. But I think corrupt, protruded might be a little more complex for you. So I did want to go through those with you. Last part of this chapter is about geopolitics and critical geopolitics specifically. It's a little complex, but there's a major theory that we do need to cover, which is the Heartland theory, and I'll get to that in just a second. So geopolitics is where we look at politics or governments and how that plays a role in geography, or how geography plays a role in the government. And there are two schools of thought on here. I mean, there are other schools, but the major ones are the German school and the American or British school. The German school is after Retzel. Retzel was a German geographer who said that states or countries are like living creatures, and they need to constantly eat or they will die. They'll be eaten by others, essentially. So it's sort of the dog eat dog world. So the idea is that you needed to constantly start eating other territory, claiming other territory as your own, or else others will sort of take over you. Now the conflict came because Hitler took this idea and to the extreme, where he basically wanted to create, the German Empire, and kept claiming other lands. And so Ratzel kind of gets a bad name because of Hitler. But that school of thought necessarily kind of makes sense, I think, if you kind of think about it. The other school of thought that we discuss is the British American school, and specifically we talk about Mackinder, who was a British man who had the Heartland theory. And he was actually laughed at for a while because his theory just seemed kind of weird. But he says that there is the heartland of the world. which is right here. So you'll notice it's Eastern Europe into Central Asia, kind of where Russia is, Kazakhstan, it's right here. And he said that this is the heartland because whoever rules it can easily get everywhere else in the world. So whoever controls this could command the world. And again, I said he was kind of laughed at until we have the USSR and we have Stalin in power after World War II, and suddenly everybody went, oh dear, maybe this is possible. Maybe the USSR will slowly continue to creep into, Western Europe and into Southwest Asia and into Africa and South Asia and even into North America very, very easily because they control this area. So that was sort of a concern for a few years. And it's still a school of thought that you need to understand, or a theory you need to understand. The idea of critical geopolitics is that we need to be cautious of trying to say that geography has as the only thing that controls government, or vice versa, and that the political leaders need to be careful about how they present their ideas of government in terms of geography and other places. Sort of that us versus them is a dangerous place to go. So these are some quotes that they have in the book, and I'll let you guys read those to yourself. I'm not going to read them out loud, but they have a very much tone to them of an us versus them. And the textbook authors are very critical of this. They say that this can create major issues in the world, because it makes, if you have a president saying these things, it can make the people of that country go, oh, well, obviously those people are bad. Those people are horrible. If they're from that area, the whole country must be bad. And of course we had this issue after 9/11 with racial profiling that happened. And if you are from, Afghanistan or Iraq, then you must be a terrorist or you must be bad. And that's where it can cause problems. And that's what the problem with the problem your textbook authors want you to be aware of. That you need to be careful about what you listen to in terms of media, in terms of your political leaders, because again, it can create this us versus them. So again, this isn't just one political party. We have Clinton, who was a Democrat. We have W. Bush, who was a Republican, saying the same types of things. And it created these sort of issues that we still have today in terms of other countries thinking we are superior, we're coming in to change things, we are better, we still have issues as a result of it. The very last section kind of deals with world order and how, on a global scale, how governments interact and work, and whether or not there is this idea of bipolar, where there's really, it's either, us versus them, essentially. Multipolar, where you may have a us, them, and other. Or unilateralism, where there's one leader and everyone just follows. And you can debate this. We can debate this in class, and you can debate this on your own. But there may also be a future where it's completely different from any of those three options as well. Maybe it's none of those, perhaps. But that's just sort of how the world works. Because we're so intertwined, because of globalization, we do think about the politics and government systems that are in place and how those relate. One issue that comes up quite a bit is this law of the sea. In 1982, it was a treaty that was made about the world's oceans and the control over them. So I'm going to kind of put this out there. I don't know that you necessarily need to memorize too much. I just want you to kind of be aware of it. The U.S. technically ratified this. Sorry about that. So you can take this sort of for what it's worth. It's not something that the United States has stresses, I suppose. But essentially, there's fishing rights that have to do with 12 nautical miles from the coast, how much you can get from that ocean and bring back to claim as your own country. Again, immigration, sanitation, those kind of things are like 24 nautical miles. And then EEZs are like an export processing zone or exploration zone. So how far out from a country you can kind of claim as your own for the resources of it, that's 200 nautical miles. Like I said, I don't know that this needs to be stressed too much, but I have seen it on AP exams in the past, so I do want you to be aware of it. Goodness, I forgot there was one last section. Okay, so last thing is the national organizations and the future of the state. First of all, a supranational organization, just as a vocab term, is 3 or more states that work together to benefit the members. There are more than 60 different supranational organizations today. It's trying to keep peace, it's trying to keep, maybe it's trying to help the environment, or maybe it's trying to feed the world, whatever it may be. It has a different purpose, it has a goal, but there's 3 or more countries working together to promote the good of all. The first major global supranational organization that we talk about is the League of Nations, and this still is not around anymore. It was proposed by Woodrow Wilson after World War I to try and prevent a future war. Obviously, that didn't quite work, but part of it is the United States didn't get involved. Woodrow Wilson wanted it, the Senate would not support him, and so the U.S. did not join, and most of the major world countries didn't join, so it kind of just failed. After World War II, there was much more sort of, we have to fix this, and so there was the want to make the United Nations. To make sure there's no World War III. And of course there hasn't been. There are still sort of logistical issues that the United Nations has. Things like the fact that if the United Nations wants to declare war, it has to have unanimous support. They do have sub-organizations within the United Nations like FAO or UNESCO or WHO that help things like helping bring education places, bringing food places, bringing doctors places, and those are obviously positives that the United Nations has had. But it is debatable about whether or not it is doing what it's supposed to be doing with in terms of peace. Again, the United Nations began after World War II. U.S., UK, and Soviet Union were major world powers, the allies of World War II, allied powers of World War II. But that changed as a result of communism and the domino effect. So then it was much more of the Cold War and conflict there. The United Nations did help sort of prevent a lot of the a possible World War III, but the roles that it has are still debatable, A regional supranational organization is going to be one that is just within a certain region. So Benelux is a great one. It's Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And this was also during World War II that they kept common taxes on their goods and got rid of quotas to kind of help each other out. Now, we're going to get into the EU being a regional plan. The Marshall Plan really was instrumental in helping establish the EU. This was a plan that the U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed to help rebuild Europe after World War II, and it gave Europe $12 billion to build up their industries and their economies and their businesses. And as a result, countries within Europe started to help each other out as well. So they first of all formed the OEEC, Organization of European Economic Cooperation, and slowly they sort of incorporated other industries and other countries until eventually the EC became the EU in 1992. They have their own currency. Again, this is a map of countries that are original members and sort of countries that would like to join. So it's a good map to look at as well. As I said, single currency, you can freely travel between, which causes problems when there's a terrorist attack. But richer countries then tend to subsidize the poorer ones, and that can cause sort of a burden on the richer countries, but also the richer countries then feel like they have a right to say how the poorer countries spend their money, and that causes some problems, which Greece and Germany have right now. As I said it here, and again, Turkey might join since it does touch Europe. It's one of those countries that touches Europe and Asia, but there's concern that because of its connection with TRNC and because it has, there's some humanitarian rights that have been been an issue in the past, and that is preventing EU from really taking Turkey under its wing and letting it become a part of the EU. Other organizations in the regions, or other regional organizations, are like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. ACS is the Association of Caribbean States. ECOWAS is Economic Community of West African States. And the CIS is the Commonwealth of Independent States. This is what formed after the USSR fell. Of course, supranationalism affects the states. Whenever you have supranationalism, there is going to be some of that sovereignty that a state has lost, because now they have to look out for other countries involved in their supranational organization. They can't just look out for themselves. But in turn, when something happens to them, they have the support of those other countries. So you kind of give up a little bit of sovereignty for that military or political help if you need it. The other issue is that some people may in turn, especially in Europe this happens, people start to identify themselves differently. So they may identify themselves as being a European rather than being a Belgian, for example, which is a little bit of an issue if you have countries within the same region fighting each other. Not that that would happen, but if you did, you might have an issue with who would fight for Belgium. Because if you feel yourself as a European rather than a Belgian, you're going to have an issue. Nuclear weapons and globalization and those effects, of course, are going to have effects on supranationalism as well. And then lastly, that idea of unilateralism we discussed earlier. Is U.S. the leader in the world? We can argue that. I would argue that it's not. I don't think that it is as important as it used to be and is a singular leader and everybody else just follows. I think your textbook kind of leads it as being that, but I don't think it necessarily is. So we can discuss that. That's something to kind of consider with the future of geopolitical world order. And that concludes our video lecture. I know this was a fairly long one, so hopefully you have left time to kind of break it up into pieces and make it a little easier for you. But I appreciate you listening, and I hope it's helpful. Thanks.